Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this wonderful USC, US-China Institute webinar. We are so fortunate today to have with us Jane Perlez of the New York Times and Scott Tong of WBUR Boston and National Public Radio, where he's host of the Here and Now program. What we're looking at today is a podcast that Jane has created and Scott has participated and helped to bring about that looks at the Great Wager. And I love that title, and we'll get to the title in just a moment. The Great Wager, who was making this big bet and has it paid off? So we put the subtitle From Nixon to Now as the title for today's event. And we'll be looking at that because the podcast, The Great Wager, which you should be listening to right after our program, that looks at the Nixon trip, what made it possible, how the relationship evolved over the years, including that key moment in 1978, 1979, when the two great powers established formal diplomatic relations. And they break a bit of news about that important visit, that important time in the US-China relationship. And so you'll want definitely to hear that in the podcast, and we'll get Jane to weigh in on what makes that so significant in just a moment. But we want to remind everyone that this is an opportunity for you to join, for you to submit questions through the course of the program using the Q&A button. We will try to get to as many of those questions as we can in the second half of our program. But we are glad to have you with us today. Thank you so much for carving out time for today's discussion. Now, one of our presenters today, Jane Perlez, she got to China ahead of Richard Nixon. She went as a university student from Australia to China in the time of the Cultural Revolution in 1966, 1967. And so she got there ahead of the US president. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But Nixon goes in 1972, and so much has changed. The US-China relationship, without question, is the most important relationship in the world today. It will do the most to shape the 21st century. So it's important to look at that origin story. Now, the US and China, of course, have had connections going back to the 18th century when the United States was a young republic. But the key moment for our purposes is 1972. And we are in the midst of marking the 50th anniversary of Nixon's famous trip to China, where he met with Chairman Mao, Zhou Enlai. And among the things that happened during that trip was the announcement of the Shanghai Communique, a joint statement by the two countries about where they were and where they hoped to go. And so we'll talk about that with our hosts. At that time, 1972, the US and China didn't really have much of an economic relationship. There was maybe $100 million in trade between the two. And that had just gotten started. There had been a ban on most US trade with China for most of the 1950s, 1960s. So Nixon begins to loosen things up. And of course, today, these are the two top economies, the two top trading nations. And in 2021, they exchanged goods and services of well over $700 billion. In a pre-pandemic period, go back to 2019, 8,000 Chinese would have arrived in the United States on average every day. 6,000 Americans would have gone on average to China every day. We have 350,000, more than that, 350,000 students studying in the United States. Many American businesses get into the black, make money because of their business operations in China. And we have with us somebody who's done a lot of reporting on that. So I'd like to just briefly introduce our two speakers today. You have their bios in the event announcement, but let me just say a couple of words about them and then go to them. So first of all, Jane Perlez has been a reporter for the New York Times since 1981. I mentioned that she first went to China in 1966, 1967 as a university student from Australia. But she very quickly came to the United States, where she reported first for the New York Post before becoming a Times reporter in 1981. She has been, for most of her career, a foreign correspondent. She's been a bureau chief in Kenya, in Poland, in Austria, in Indonesia, in Pakistan, and in Beijing. She has reported on major civil conflict. For example, in Somalia, she's reported on the trauma in Pakistan, and also trauma in the Balkans. When she was based in Austria, reporting on conflict as Yugoslavia dissolved. So she has done a lot of on-the-ground reporting. She's been recognized by the Pulitzer Committee. She was a finalist for one award, and she received the Pulitzer in 2009. She was the Beijing Bureau chief for the New York Times from 2011 to 2019. And I would encourage you folks to read all the range of stories that she covered, which included cultural reporting, diplomatic reporting, political reporting. One essay that she contributed to a volume called the Beijing Bureau, a collection of work by journalists that originated in Australia. It's a wonderful look at how China has evolved through, as she titles it, father and son. And so there's wonderful stuff there. Now, Jane is best known as a writer. Scott Tong, on the other hand, has devoted his career to being a broadcast journalist. He worked first for the Public Broadcasting Service for the NewsHour program. Then he began to work for Marketplace Radio. And I first met Scott when he was the Marketplace Bureau Chief in Shanghai. And so he was based in Shanghai, reporting on the tremendous economic changes underway in China and how those were connected to the United States and the greater world. Now, he has also reported from a wide variety of countries, including some countries in Africa, others in Asia. US-China Institute loyalists know him, though, perhaps for his book, A Village with My Name, a family history of China's opening to the world. And this is a tremendous book. After you listen to the podcast, go and watch Scott's presentation here at USC about his family history and read that book, which takes you into the 19th, early 20th century, up through his own scurrying about China, learning about his family's past and how that past has been interconnected with China's opening to this wider world. So, friends, thank you all for being here. Don't hesitate to post your questions using the Q&A button. And please join me wherever you are in welcoming Jane and Scott to these microphones. So thank you both for being here. Let's begin, if we could, Jane, with the question of why call it the Great Wager?
Well, that's an interesting question. I can tell you a little secret, actually. I wanted to call it something else. Maybe I'll tell you that off camera. But the Great Wager, I think it summarizes the risks that Nixon took and the risks that Mao took. I mean, Mao had painted the United States as the running dogs of capitalism for years. And Nixon was taking a risk from his right wing in particular. But Nixon had a very firm idea and he went for it. And despite what they say in Washington today, I think he won.
No, I would quite concur with that. He definitely won. If we go back 50 years, and you just highlighted some of the risks, maybe you and Scott can say something more about why they were willing to take these risks. I think you're right. I think they won that bet. But what were those risks, and why do you think they won?
I'll just add one more thing, then hand over to Scott. I think that Nixon was very aware of the fact that the Soviet Union and the United States were almost at nuclear parity. And this was a very scary and serious thing. And a way to try and bring the Soviet Union to its senses was to peel away China from them. They were already at odds. They were already basically fighting a war on the border. But to just give the Soviets a shake-up, that they just couldn't tread all over China and nuke them, as one of them suggested, and bring China to the American side, created a sophisticated kind of triangular diplomacy. But I'll let Scott illuminate.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Clay, for having Jane and me for this. I mean, you've been so supportive of the programs I work for and for me. So it's so great to be here with you. You know, when I think about the stakes for Nixon, and, you know, I'm a Gen Xer. For me, this is a historical thing that happened because, I was 3 when this trip actually happened. But, you know, as I kind of read more about this and work with Jane and the team at WBUR on this podcast, it seems like there are so many vectors of what Nixon had, or risk and opportunity for Nixon, right? One was this geopolitical positioning, right? China and Russia were having all kinds of border issues and fighting, and this was a moment that he exploited, right, to lure the Chinese from the clutches of the Soviets in the Cold War, and to gain the leverage that the United States did eventually get against the Soviets. There was also his own political self-interest. In 1972, it wasn't so clear that he was going to be reelected then. The Vietnam War was not going very well. So, you know, we all know that that Nixon and Henry Kissinger, you know, perhaps they were geopolitical visionaries. They certainly knew about their own self-interest as well. And then there was, of course, Vietnam going on, and if there was a way to either allow the Chinese to kind of pull back from their support, or to deliver a perception to the American voters that was happening, because obviously that is something that Americans were seeing on television every night. So that was what Nixon had to gain. And of course, the huge risk was, before he was able to pull this off, he had to keep it secret. Because, and Jane tells us so well in the podcast, that if his members of his own party, the Republican Party, the staunch anti-communist Republican Party, if they got onto this, if the news media got onto this before he pulled it off, before he kind of orchestrated the messaging for this, he would have been excoriated publicly for, right, selling out to the, you know, evil, godless communist Chinese. So it was certainly a lot to gain and a lot of risk in play, particularly for Richard Nixon. And just briefly as a storytelling lever, I mean, this is such a complicated story, of course, and certainly in audio, we have to simplify it and find kind of a spine of this. And for me, and Jane's sick of hearing me talk about this, I think a lot of Americans just have a fascination with Nixon. And to me, this mission impossible, as it were, for Nixon and Kissinger and hardly anybody else who knew, was a very enticing way to try to lure the listener in.
Well, I want to pick up on that audio side of this discussion. And one of the things that we can get out of the declassified documents relating to Kissinger's, pre-Nixon trip visits is that Zhou Enlai was aware of the election too. And at one point, Zhou Enlai says, what time frame are we talking about? Are we talking about before the 1972 election, or are we talking about 1976 as a deadline for normalization? And Kissinger brushes him off. But let me come back to this audio question, because for me, that's so powerful. And that comes through in this podcast. And I wanted to ask Jane, she has worked, with audio previously, but primarily you've been a print reporter. What did you seek to do with the audio? You certainly do it with your introductions, adding to the drama of what's going on, placing us there, but also bringing in these voices. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, I'll just tell you a little story to begin. I left Beijing in the fall of 2019, and I was very lucky. I had a fellowship at the Schoenstein Center at Harvard, and it was all very nice. And then I said, I suppose I'm supposed to do something for you. And they said, yeah, you're supposed to write a paper. And I said, oh, paper. Oh, how long is that supposed to be? And they said, 15,000 words. I said, forget it. I've been a journalist all my life. No way. I'm going to do a podcast. And I think Scott's tired of hearing this, but, I didn't know what a podcast was. I just really, because I'd been out of the country for so many years, but I knew that it was a new way of getting at people. And, as a kid in Australia, I have to say, growing up, I used to listen to this show called The Argonauts. I can remember sitting on the floor, and it was a show about all the mythology about Greece, and it just took you away. I mean, I just knew that radio could take people into a different place. And so that's, I think, what we've tried to do with this podcast. Definitely did not want to do just an interview show with talking heads. We wanted to bring the atmosphere of the period so that people could understand, what Nixon and Kissinger were like, what Mao and Zhou Enlai were like, that China was very poor, it was very chaotic. And in fact, Nixon and Kissinger's intelligence about China was really terrible. I mean, they had no idea that Mao was so sick, for example. And so we were able to make something of Mao's sickness because we've all been lucky. His doctor escaped and wrote an amazing memoir where there are all kinds of very delicious details of how they prepared Mao for Nixon's visit that morning. So it's those kinds of details that I think we have tried to bring alive for the listener and bring them right into Beijing of the period. The Americans don't know it, but the chairman is actually gravely ill. He suffers from a severe heart condition. His brain isn't getting enough oxygen. A month before, his pulse stopped. While Nixon is sitting in his shorts, unsure of whether or not he'll meet Mao, the Chinese are scrambling to make sure the chairman looks as presentable as possible. Mao's doctors ease him out of his bathrobe. They stuff his bloated body into a new suit. They trim his hair. Mao has been so out of it that he has to practice getting up and sitting down from his big puffy armchair with the help of the 2 young nurses who take care of him. They even hide oxygen tanks and a respirator in the furniture and behind the potted plants.
That is a terrific example of what all of you will get from this podcast. You will get a sense that doesn't come through, with reading about these things. So, for example, I'm somebody who knows a little bit about the journey, but the notion of Nixon, getting ready to take a shower and get some rest after this, trans-Pacific journey, and then we have to go.
Yeah. Well, one thing that works certainly in TV and video as well as audio is these very detailed scenes. And Jane is painting with Mao. They've got to prepare this partially alive person at this point, right? They have to trim his hair. They have to put his bathrobe on. We had an event at WBUR in Boston yesterday, and we interviewed the stage director for the opera, which came out in the late 80s about Nixon and China. And you saw the Mao character and three, nurse characters, carrying him around so he wouldn't fall down. So I think, to me, what really can work in storytelling, and you heard a few of the pieces, is one is the scene, the kind of just go somewhere and tell a fair bit of the scene. The other is and this is the audio magic that I hardly know anything about, is the scoring, the music underneath. You heard a little bit of the heartbeat. That's a lot of work by people who are really good at it, and they just kind of pull you along with the sound effects, whether it's the music or whatever else is coming. And then it's also the writing. If you look at an audio script, the sentences are much shorter than, say, in a newspaper article that Jane will write. So we try to kind of put those together. As I was thinking about that, there's one other scene that we came back and back to and said, boy, I was first grabbed by this scene, and that is in episode 1 of our podcast, when the Americans are going around the world trying to find Chinese diplomats to connect to. And they arrive in an attempt in Warsaw, of all places, right, where there's a fashion show, and it gets crazy. But that's where this happened, right, where the Chinese diplomats were there, and we found the retired diplomat Tom Simons to help tell us the story. He says he remembers what the models at the fashion show were wearing there, and when the Chinese got up to leave, presumably it maybe was a little much for them. He and his boss, the ambassador to Poland, had to chase them down and say, our president wants to talk to yours. So those scenes, I think, really help to kind of bring the listener, in this case, somewhere to help tell the story. Obviously, there are all these trade-offs in audio. You can't tell the whole story. There's a lot of the story we had to leave out in favor of kind of choosing scenes like this. And those are the kind of the trade-offs of storytelling.
Jane, that moment in the podcast also touched me profoundly, because you're talking about this fashion show where the American diplomats are trying to connect with the Chinese ones, because there is no standard mechanism for this. And that helps us to understand, what they were trying to do, what kind of breakthrough we were talking about, just to be able to have a conversation. And you illustrate it with models wearing skimpier and skimpier dresses, and that perhaps coming as a challenge for the Chinese diplomats. And I was wondering if you could pick that up, not that particular scene, but that that part of this, because you're an expert on this. You've written about it for a long time, and you've consumed all of the books on the subject, all of these kinds of things. What surprised you as you plunged into this project?
Well, I think what surprised me most is the perseverance and the belief that Nixon had in his mission. He'd been on a trip as vice president to Asia in 1953. And I came to understand, I think, that it was a long trip. It was a couple of months. When those days it took ages to get from place to place. But anyway, it was a long trip. It was all new to him, although he'd fought in the Pacific in World War II. But he could see that Asia was the future. And to see that in 1953, I think is quite extraordinary. And although he didn't go to China, he did go to then Formosa. And I think he was underwhelmed with Chiang Kai-shek, actually. And I don't think he said it publicly, but you get the inferences as it goes along. And he just thought, and he had several business friends, Canadian businessman who was a friend who was starting to do business even in the 1960s. So he was fascinated by China. And once he latched onto this idea in 1967, he wrote this piece for Foreign Affairs that we all know about, that we should consider China as a member of the world community. He just went for it. And I have great admiration for that.
Now that is, again, part of the great wager, as it were, but also the imagination to be able to see something that didn't exist, that he might be able to help to bring something about that would make a difference, certainly for him politically, but for his nation and for the world. That imagination, that comes through. And you've included a lot of clips of Nixon speaking, both on this journey, but also prior to it. But of course, he passed away, 25 years ago. So you couldn't interview him. If you had been able to interview him, what would you have asked?
Well, I didn't think it was too bad that we couldn't interview him, because I think we have a good replacement, actually. Dick Reeves was, he was a model of a reporter. I was this young kid reporter in New York City, and Richard Reeves was a big political reporter. And then he went on to write these biographies of Kennedy, Reagan, and Nixon. And he and Nixon were quite different politically. But after Nixon was forced out of office, Dick Reeves and Nixon remained quite friendly. And he had Reeves, before he died, told this extraordinary story at the JFK Library, interestingly, saying, Nixon told me that the United States would face conflict with China because China would grow so much. And Nixon didn't know whether it would be military conflict or economic conflict, but it would come, and it was up to his successors to try and delay that and prevent it for as long as possible, because Nixon said quite darkly, which was his nature, I guess, the Far East, as he called China, will win, will prevail. So he could see what was coming.
And so that's that visionary, that imagination that, that powered his effort to reach out. And on the other side, we know, of course, that there's some reason for the Chinese side wanting to reach out, that they have their own issues with the Soviet Union. You've already highlighted some of those, and they will make common cause, at least on this front, with those people that Mao, as you illustrated, had condemned, right, as this great enemy. Now, with Nixon, we have an open door, but we have not established formal diplomatic relations. And in the podcast, you take us to formal diplomatic relations, and maybe you could say something about ways in which the American side wanted to, build a rapport, build a connection with Beijing that would generate a certain amount of trust that the United States would be a very useful partner in this enterprise.
And this is where Jane has her great reveal in episode 4.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, Scott, why don't you address this first?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll try to set it up. Part of the relationship that the Nixon administration and later the Carter administration has is well, what kinds of things can we share to take on our common enemy? And that is surveillance technology that the Americans have, and to put it in a place next to the Russian border that is owned by China. So there's a natural way in a place to collaborate and collect information that would be useful to both sides. So there are secret meetings. There is talk of exchanging intelligence hardware, exchanging some of this information. There is one scene where Chinese officials and U.S. officials meet in a safe house in the U.S. So, some of it is kind of cloaky here. But I should toss it to Jane, because there was one, very critical intelligence meeting that came after the Nixon administration, but is part of this, I guess, build-up in relations as far as the intelligence relationship.
Well, I'll just try and be quite brief. In some ways, there was some luck in that there was a meeting of the minds between the Carter administration's national security advisors, Big Brzezinski, who was very anti-Soviet, and Deng Xiaoping, who was even more anti-Soviet than Mao and Zhou Enlai. So when the Americans needed a new place to monitor the Soviet missile tests of the late 70s and early 80s. There were arms control agreements that the Soviets had to meet certain standards in their missile tests. And the Americans had these stations in Iran, which were doing the job, and the Shah collapsed. And so Jim Lilly was looking at a map one day, and he recounts in his memoir, in Xinjiang by the border, that's got a very good sight line to where the Soviets test their missiles. So they agreed to set up these secret monitoring stations. And when Deng Xiaoping came to Washington for his celebrated state visit, which most people remember because he went to Texas and wore a cowboy hat. But before he did that, he asked to go to the CIA headquarters. And, the very, very, very small group of people knew about this. And they had to scurry around and find some time on his very public schedule where they could get him in there. And they found some time on his last night in Washington, and his limousine, went down into the underground car park. They took him to the first floor communications center, showed him the map of China where the listening stations would be. They took him up to the 7th floor to meet Stansfield Turner and Carlucci, Frank Carlucci, the deputy. And they talked for 45 minutes, and then he left. First and last time a leader of communist China has been to the CIA.
Yeah, and that is a remarkable scene in the podcast. And so Scott's gone ahead and told people which episode to tune into. That would be episode 4, but you'll want to listen to the entire series. It's really lively. And one of the things that I took away, because we've read a little bit about the intelligence sharing and these posts, but you actually take us there. In terms of describing what it must have been like for the CIA officers who were stationed there to work with Chinese colleagues. And that vividness is really, really powerful and adds so much to our understanding, again, of, this everybody's connected all the time age, right? Today, based in Boston, you can communicate with your colleagues in Beijing, in any place, Islamabad, any place, using video. You can have instant linkage, but that was just not the case. And you described some of that with Nixon's trip. We had, inadequate intelligence. One of the things that comes through is, where are the people? the president, especially Nixon, because in 1953 on that trip, he had pushed the State Department to make sure that there were people at each one of his stops. And this was a bit of a break. And so maybe you could say something about both the secrecy. Scott has already talked a little bit about keeping the entire enterprise. Nixon and Kissinger worked to keep the circle of people who knew about it very, very small. But also the role of the press in this relationship, a role that you've been part of over your careers.
Well, this was the first overseas trip by an American president that was beamed back live. I mean, you know this very well. You've documented it very well at the university. But in hindsight, that seems so antiquated from today. I mean, they had to fly. The Americans had to fly in a whole ground station on a 747 to be able to broadcast back live. So, but it was a huge. The trip took on a kind of splendor of its own back home. I mean, they had people in the network studios demonstrating to the viewers at home how to use chopsticks. I mean, it seems a little crazy now. And Nixon, who didn't want to go with any reporters when the thing was first being planned in the fall of 1971. He went in February 1972. He told Haldeman, no reporters. Oh, just, the Wires and one other, and definitely not the New York Times and definitely not the Washington Post, because he hated them because of the Pentagon Papers. Then he ended up taking 80 reporters, as you well know. And when he got back, he had someone call around the conservative Republican circles to see how it went down. And someone called Ronald Reagan, who was then California governor. And Reagan said, oh, it was great. It should just be a television pilot for a whole series.
Well, Jane, as you say, the Pentagon Papers had been published by then, right? By the time Nixon went to China, right? That more true history of what really happened in the Vietnam War, and that came out and probably just reinforced Nixon's view of the news media and how double-edged it can be. Just in the lead up to this, I don't know if your team can play another clip, but there is another great moment on the China side where, on one hand, it has to be stage managed, but when Nixon arrived in February of 1972, he wasn't sure how things were going to go, right? And we've heard how we don't know if or when Mao is going to meet with him, but he comes to the airport and there's no big welcome, that he doesn't receive that because things are still in play. They're not sure how this is going to end.
When Air Force One lands in Beijing on that cold February morning, the pilot radios to an American Secret Service agent on the tarmac. Do not see any crowds, says the pilot.
Peking Airport is seldom busy, and despite the president's arrival, it wasn't much different on this day.
The Americans know that the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, who had just been in Beijing, attracted huge crowds at the airport. But now the airport is empty, save for an honor guard. No big welcome.
That comes through in that episode of the podcast. And again, the contrast between, a visit from the leader of Ethiopia and the leader of the United States. And that, of course, led to some question about, are they really ready to talk? So that really does come through. I want to know, we have a question from one of the most distinguished scholars of law in China, and he asks, how do I get this? How do I get access to the podcast? And the good news is it's free and it's accessible. And so in the chat, we posted a link to it. It's also on the website. But Scott, why don't you go ahead and remind everybody?
Sure. You can go into your favorite podcast app, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever. And you can sign up for it's part of the Here and Now feed. So because we're putting excerpts of this on Here and Now. So if you search for Here and Now and you save or follow that feed, then all of the episodes will be there. All 5 have dropped, so you can binge it if you want. You can also, I know it's pretty hard if you just put in The Great Wager in the Apple Podcast app. I couldn't find it, but in Spotify, you can just put in The Great Wager in the search box and you can find it that way. But for sure, if you go to the Here and Now and put that in, or if you go to the website Here and Now, you'll find a link to the episodes.
Yeah, all that works. And look again in the chat, the chat side of your Zoom screen, and it's already been posted there. A very quick and simple link. And definitely do what Scott just suggested. Binge this. Listen to all 5 episodes. You will be richly rewarded. And so that has just been posted again to the chat section. Now, one of the things that one of our participants, one of the attendees, has asked about is the world does change with this visit. And this scholar asks, how much of this should we, attribute to the individuals, and how much to just the momentum, and how much to, in retrospect, it was an obvious policy choice? I think, Jane, you've answered this in part, but if you could address it again.
I don't think it was so obvious, actually. China was in total chaos at the time. And the Americans had lousy intelligence. I mean, they didn't know what was going on in there. And I can remember on that student trip when I went in 1967, I mean, we were just a bunch of, apolitical students going for a summer trip. We had no idea we were going to be in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. But we came out in Hong Kong, and the world's press, Charlie Moore and Tilman Durden, took myself and another member of the student group to lunch at Jimmy's Kitchen. I mean, this is indelibly impressed on my mind ever since, because they didn't know anything. We had been there for 3 weeks. So that's just a way of saying I don't think it was so obvious. And I do think it was the confluence of Nixon seeing the opportunity and Mao needing it and grasping onto the reed that was offered.
Yeah, I agree. I think in certain ways, and you've both talked about their interests that aligned, but it still takes the individuals, right? Whether they're visionary or they're egomaniacal or however to describe them, it still takes individuals, I think, to reach out and make it happen the right way. I think from Nixon's perspective, the secrecy was an essential part for a Republican to pull it off.
Well, and as you say, it's not enough to have the vision. You actually have to somehow execute this. And one of the things that comes through in the podcast is, the tough negotiations that went on at every stage of this. Because even though the grand logic may be apparent, the mechanics are very complicated, including the fact, of course, that the United States has a diplomatic relationship with Taipei and had for a long time, and that we had a mutual defense treaty also with the Republic of China. So we're talking about a major shift. And maybe you could say something about the stickiness of that Taiwan question that comes through in the podcast and comes through today.
Well, I think actually, I think Scott's probably saying, "Oh, why is Jane being so kind to Nixon?" I don't mean to be kind to Nixon, but they fudged it in the end in 1972 on the last day of the communique. They just fudged it, which was the only thing they could do. They came out with this communique, which each side set down what it believed, And, people today say, oh, Washington gave away too much on Taiwan. They said there was only one China, da, 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 da. Well, what were you to do? If you're going to do this thing, if you're going to make relations with China, which was the goal, to set a kind of new balance of power, then if you set the terms of what should happen to Taiwan further down the road, that seems to me a pretty smart move.
That's it. Say, we aren't going to solve this, but we're not going to let it keep us from talking. And in fact, even in 1978, 1979, with the establishment of diplomatic relations and the ending of the diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, again, it's kicked down the road, kicking the can a little bit farther down the line, because we can't deal with this. We can't resolve it in a way that's satisfactory. So let's keep it from blocking progress on all the other kinds of things that we were seeking to accomplish. Now, one of our attendees has asked the question that others are asking. Was Nixon thinking he was going to change China? Were Nixon and Kissinger and later American leaders, did they think that a democratic China was going to emerge out of this relationship?
Well, I'd just like to answer this very quickly. I think that Nixon did not want to change China. He was a realist. I mean, he would liked it if China was going to become democratic, but that was not his sole purpose. And it wasn't Kissinger's, obviously, either. Now, presidents down the line, Clinton came out with some sayings like that. But, Clay, my favorite book on China is called To Change China by Jonathan Spence. And it's this wonderful group of essays that you know very well that talks about how foreigners who've gone to China since the Jesuits in the 16th century until after World War II have gone there trying to make China into their own image, and they've all left with their tails between their legs. And frankly, I think it's kind of arrogant for anybody to go to another country and say, well, you've got to be like us.
Yeah, well, the American missionaries also, as far as the tally of saved souls, also failed miserably in that regard. But along the way, I mean, they provided education for people like my grandmother. She had her feet unbound at the age of 8, and some of that was introduced. But but these kind of top level, trying to, maybe that's everywhere in the world, trying to take a system and bring it over, copy and paste, whatever. I guess we don't have a lot of examples in history where that has worked, and surely not the case with the U.S. and China. I guess maybe the interesting question is how this concept had so much currency for so long. I mean, the Clinton administration was not that long ago, and I certainly remember that was the tantalizing argument that economically, if we allow them to open up, it's gonna deliver political openness as well. It sure sounds good.
Well, and one pundit put it, if you have choices of coffee at Starbucks, why can't you choose your leaders? That sort of thing, making that kind of connection, that accustomed to greater range of control over one's own life leads you to demand, something more. That's been part of the argument that some have put forward. But as you, I think, stated quite clearly, this was done, with Nixon, with Kissinger, with Carter, and the successors. They were concerned about serving American interests. And maybe we could come back to that, because one of the things, of course, that is part of Jane's opening for each episode of the podcast is how this thing began and then how it's come apart, or is it coming apart?
Well, it's certainly come apart. I mean, we just have to see the news, the very dispiriting news yesterday and today. I mean, it does look, no matter which way you slice it, that it's now China and Russia against the United States. And I think, there's a lot of talk in the last 2 days about how Xi Jinping may not have known about Putin's plans to invade. It doesn't matter. I mean, Xi has lined up in the Moscow column, and that's quite a shift.
Yeah, as the Olympics in Beijing were getting ready to open, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping meet. We have a joint proclamation issued. Putin is one of the few leaders who's there at the opening ceremonies, and all of that sort of discussion. So you definitely have that. And so as we look at this 50-year stretch, what do we take away? What do we take away? Not just the history, but what big messages do we see emerging out of this 50-year dance?
I think, Scott, you've got some opinions about this.
Yeah, Gishen has a book out, the novelist and short story writer, and it's called Thank You, Mr. Nixon. That's just out for this anniversary too. And in her own sardonic way, I think what she tries to do is to shine a light on how it was perceived by the Chinese people. And in the 50 years since, my goodness, right, how life has changed. Everyone attending this has a story, an idea, a personal life story of how life has changed, and certainly this multi-stage opening of the door to the outside world, and as some economic historians would say, reopening of the door to the outside world has changed lives. Just as to whet your appetite, the first short story in Gishen's book is written from the perspective of the girl. So when Nixon went to China in 1972, he took 1 or 2 days for sightseeing, and he went to Hangzhou, and he met 1 or 2 girls and took pictures with them. So this girl in this short story, she's writing a letter to Mr. Nixon. That's where the line "Thank you, Mr. Nixon" comes from, and she's writing it from heaven. And she's commenting on all of this and how it's changed China. And she's sending it to Richard Nixon, who was in hell, and making the argument that, I'm not so sure that's where you belong. I mean, it's has that level of absurdity. It's a great read, but I think the serious question Gishen it wants us to ask is, what are the lives that have changed in China?
Jane, I don't know if you wanted to pick up on that or not.
Oh, I think there's no question that lives have changed so dramatically in China, so dramatically. But I think on the downside, or one of the sad things, is that with that, we still don't understand each other. I think we have a closing comment from Hong Huang in the 5th episode. And she comes about as close as you can get to be bicultural. Mm-hmm. And she says, I still don't think the Chinese understand the United States, and the United States doesn't understand China. And I think that's a very serious situation, particularly now that the Beijing has decided to basically cut off China from the United States and from other countries. So it's going to become even more difficult for people, for business, for culture, for all kinds of contexts. I mean, they're sliding away in front of our eyes.
Just a couple of quick comments. One is to pick up on Scott's suggestion of looking to fiction for certain insights that you may not get from other sources. Chen Roshi, was a Taiwan writer who wound up in China during the Cultural Revolution. And her collection of stories, which is published in English as The Execution of Mayor Yin, is a wonderful collection, well worth your time. And I've always remembered a single story included in that collection having to do with a big fish. And that had to do with efforts to manage the image of China during the Nixon visit, and what was on display, but not actually for sale for ordinary people. And so that's definitely there. But the point that you've just made about misunderstanding, that does seem to be a constant. And in fact, on the eve of the Nixon trip, CBS broadcast a documentary by Irv Drasnin called Misunderstanding China. And at each commercial break, an announcer intoned, "Misunderstanding China will continue."
Oh, that's so incredible. That's so incredible. That's mind-blowing.
It
Totally
is.
mind-blowing.
It is quite remarkable. Both of you have spent years reporting, about the world, but being on the ground in China, helping all of us better understand China and how China is interconnected. And so it's quite distressing to suggest that, that those connections may be constrained, may be limited. On the other hand, one thing that you can take away from this is that all kinds of things are possible. It takes imagination, it takes courage, and maybe it takes a little bit of risk.
Oh, I think so. I find it a little, I can't quite understand, and I find it a little disconcerting to think about why Washington can't find a way to. I understand all the disappointments, and I understand the differences, and I understand that the relationship can't be as it was. But I find it difficult to understand why there can't be some decent contact that keeps the lines of communication open in a way for our security, basically. I mean, I'm not talking about sending XYZ orchestra. I'm talking about national interest. I mean, it's in our national interest that we know and understand what's going on in the minds of Beijing. And there seems to be a shortage of that, and vice versa from Beijing to Washington.
Well, and that's one of the points. Yeah, you worked the diplomatic beat in DC as well as in Beijing and elsewhere, and so you're quite aware of constraining these contacts can have real negative consequences if you're talking about others but not talking with them. If you're not talking to each other, but simply describing and ascribing motives to people.
I mean, I just like to add one thing. I mean, I was in Beijing during much of the Obama administration, and honestly, I just think that they were wasted years. They spent all this effort and time on these so-called economic and security dialogue where hundreds of diplomats came from each side and did nothing for 5 days. And this was a masquerade for doing something. And at the same time, the Obama administration didn't have their eye on the ball when China was taking advantage in the South China Sea. There are other examples like this. And now we're paying the price.
Scott, any comments?
I feel like I live in Washington, and I feel like the tone had changed by the time I moved back to the States, and that was 2010. So I left in 2006, and I felt like there was still some semblance of debate over the utility of having these connections with China, all kinds of these connections. And the tone was much more, it was an echo chamber by the time I got back, that it wasn't worth it. This bipartisan, number one, China's intentions cannot be pure, or cannot be useful to understand, that the assumption that it would, that the conflating of the Chinese government and the Chinese people may be kind of going to your point that where are we? It was very striking and strikingly disappointing to me to sense the official Washington conversation about China for at least a decade now.
Disappointment. Disappointment winds up being one of the themes. It's certainly one of the themes of Jonathan Spence's To Change China, that all sorts of intentions and efforts don't necessarily yield the results that one hopes. You have the medical missionary Peter Parker in that volume, but people have made a difference. And Scott's book talks about the missionary college and a lot more on that subject. But friends, we're going to have to wrap it up. I just want to encourage everybody who is participating in today's webinar to go, download, listen, learn from, and certainly enjoy this 5-episode podcast, The Great Wager. It is well worth your time, but don't just do it for yourself. Share it with others, because it is a terrific contribution to our understanding of how we got where we are today, the world as it was, and the forces and the people that helped to change it. So, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, I hope you'll join us in thanking Jane Perlez and Scott Tong for giving us this podcast and giving us this time with them today. So wherever you are, go ahead and cheer, and definitely go to the website, start listening.